I'm Melanie Saywood, and you are tuning in to The Pink Elephant. Hi there, and welcome to the Pink Elephant podcast. The theme that I wanted to cover in this month's episode is actually quite a big one. It's actually so big and needs to be unpacked to such a degree that I'm going to dedicate 2 episodes to it. So consider this part 1 of a 2-part series. Now, I'm not actually going to reveal the topic to you because I'd love the text to reveal it to you. But what I will say is that we'll be looking in detail at the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a really peculiar book. I've met many Christians who haven't even read this book, or they've attempted to and decided it was just too negative. I first read the book of Ecclesiastes in my teenage years. I can't tell you exactly when, but I felt relieved to read this book. For the first time, I felt understood by God. I felt I had met someone, the author, who shared my perspective. Now, I'll discourage you at this point from psychoanalyzing me because I am not a negative person. But what I appreciated about Ecclesiastes is the author's dedication to wanting to understand the purpose of life. I appreciated that he could see that there are some endeavors that we take up in life that we never question, and yet they are kind of meaningless. You can probably imagine now why I was so infuriating for my mother. My mother just wanted me to study hard, to get a good job, to work hard, buy a house, get married, and have children, so that I could have children who would also study hard, get a good job, work hard, buy a house, get married, and have children of their own. And so goes the cycle. And I would presume for many of you, this is the general idea that your parents have had for you too. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that idea. But the idea that life could be scripted just didn't do it for me. I would often ask my mum, why do I have to do that? What's the point of it all? Is it really going to make any difference? What's the meaning of it all? It especially got complicated when my mum translated onto me her own expectations of womanhood. Mel, you need to learn how to cook and clean. I was cooking and cleaning for my family when I was 16 years old. To which I would respond, why? Why is cooking and cleaning inherent to the female identity? I didn't say it quite so eloquently, but I just simply wasn't the kind of person who just accepted social and cultural norms because I was told. I might have been a calm, patient person and not necessarily argumentative, but I had to be convinced. See, the position that fueled my thinking from an early age is this. If I only have one life to live, I only have one chance to make this life meaningful. I'm not going to waste my energy and time doing things that are meaningless. I'm going to understand my true purpose and do that thing. I'm not wasting my days fulfilling someone else's expectations of me if it doesn't have any overall value and meaning. I'm just not interested in that. So I've taken a very long path to say that Ecclesiastes spoke my language, and I decided at the time that Ecclesiastes was my favorite book of the Bible. So recently, as I was studying, Ecclesiastes came up again, and a scholar used a word to describe Ecclesiastes that was just so outside of my understanding of that book, and so I decided to reread it. As I read it, I could sense the Holy Spirit embedding in me a new curiosity for this book, and I could not move out of the text until I heard what the Holy Spirit was trying to show me. Ecclesiastes is about 12 chapters, so even if you read 1 chapter a day, you're done in 2 weeks. It's not a super lengthy book at all. But I found myself in the book of Ecclesiastes for months. I read it over and over and over and over, again and again and again. I knew that there was something in it that I needed to see differently. And boy, did I see it. And what I saw left me almost mentally stuck, if you can imagine. I thought I knew what this book was about, and I was totally wrong. And so over these next 2 episodes, I'm going to unpack for you what I saw in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I have to warn you, it is commonplace for me to talk about subjects and topics that will challenge you. I mean, that's why I do this podcast. Because I'm totally convinced that God is who he says he is, and that if we aren't experiencing the life that he intends for us to live, then maybe there is some deficit in how we are seeing and interpreting his word. That's why I am going deeper. But I am not exaggerating when I say that what I saw in the book of Ecclesiastes challenged me so deeply that I almost, just almost, had a crisis of faith. Actually, it's probably better defined as a crisis of life, because I wasn't questioning God and his existence. I could see how accurate what God had shown me was, but it would require me to change everything. I mean, quite literally everything about the way I live life today. This teaching is really, really hard. So much so that when I chatted with a fellow believer, just a tiny morsel of what I was seeing in the text, the believer got their back up and seemed offended. This message is offensive. But if we are truly to be seekers of truth, we can't ignore this text, nor the difficult message within it. As long as it is in the Bible, I must believe that it offers something from my experience of faith in Jesus Christ. And believe me, it does. It's just not the inspirational message that we want to hear. I mean, it's encouraging, but it's not inspiring. And I'll let you try and figure out the difference between those two words. Okay, I think I've prefaced this message enough. We got a fair bit to get through, so let's get started. So just to give you a little context about some scholarly matters relating to Ecclesiastes that are kind of important. So you guys know that it's one of the wisdom literature. It sits like between, well, now you're testing me, Song of Songs, I believe, and Proverbs. But there's some other things that you need to know about it. Generally speaking, the consensus is that Solomon is the author of Ecclesiastes. This would be partly based on the beginning of the book that identifies the author as a king of Jerusalem and the son of David. And of course, he happens to be the character who was given wisdom by God. But Solomon doesn't claim authorship like in the text. He doesn't clearly and explicitly say that he is the author. He actually calls himself Koheleth, which means teacher. Therefore, from a scholarly perspective, Solomon may not be the author. There are some other reasons that the scholars believe this also. The dating of the text is really, really difficult. I'd even go so far to say as questionable. If Solomon is the author, it would place the text during the time he lived, which is around the 900 BCs. But the text itself has some words or phrases that are described to be Aramaisms. So if you haven't heard that term before, Aramaism comes from the word Aramaic, which is a language. And I believe that it is one of the first kind of international languages. So I'm using those little finger quote things when I say international, but it was like a language that spread and was being used by like everyday people across that region. This happened because of ports and trading, and it made possible for people to trade with other people groups, right? So this happened later than the 900s. That's the evidence we have about Aramaic, is that it was later than that, which makes the timing of Ecclesiastes not the same as Solomon. So there are many different arguments and debates about how this happens. There is a suggestion that there is more than one person involved in the writing of the text. This is based on the fact that there are two different voices in the text. So by voice, I basically mean that there are different styles of speaking or tone in the text. So, I mean, why would I tell you this? Well, I guess if I'm going to teach you a bit about a book, I don't want you to be walking around like an idiot, not knowing a bit of the complexities behind the text. There's nothing worse than giving a loaded weapon to someone who's never held a gun. But also, I think it's important to what we are exploring that we understand that there is difficulty in putting the text in a context. Like, it's really hard to work out the timing that this book came from. Secondly, there was debate in the ancient rabbinical times about whether Ecclesiastes should be included in the Old Testament. Ultimately, we don't have any information as to why it was included. It's not clear from the historical information we have, the rhetoric behind that decision. To me, the reason this is important is that it explains that Ecclesiastes has some peculiarities about it as a biblical text. It actually doesn't say a lot about God. And even the famous ending, which instructs the reader to fear God, which we're going to eventually talk about, it somehow doesn't really seem to conclude the text. It's not the satisfying resolution that you would expect it to be. You still close the book feeling a little bit at a loss. And one more thing before we move on in terms of scholarly aspects. It's generally understood that Ecclesiastes is not meant to be a standalone text. By that I mean that it's not a part of a series or anything like that, but the three books of wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, by themselves don't provide a full view of the topic of wisdom. Wisdom is best understood when you read all of those three texts together. Can't really get into it here, but I would suggest watching the videos about wisdom that the Bible Project actually made, because it looks at the three books in detail and then collectively. Okay, so let's talk about Ecclesiastes. There are some important ideas that the author explores in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, which I think frame the book well in terms of where it's heading. So he firstly starts off with this shocking statement in verse 2, and it's probably the thing you remember of Ecclesiastes. He says, "Meaningless, meaningless," says the teacher, "utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." Now this opening alone would be enough to put the average Christian off, right? Doesn't it sound like he's having a bit of an existential crisis? Meaningless. Like, this is a huge statement, and he's not saying some things are meaningless. He's saying all things are meaningless. Okay, let's mellow this baby out a bit. Most scholars agree that meaningless is not the best rendering of the word in the Hebrew here. The author doesn't appear to be trying to suggest that all things are devoid of meaning. Sometimes you'll see the word vanity used in different translations, but even this isn't really a great rendering of the Hebrew word either. And considering this word prefaces what is to come in the book, the choice of word in translating actually really matters. The rendering of meaningless is far too extreme for what the author is really trying to say through this text. It makes it sound much more negative than the tone of the overall book warrants, because in some ways there's some positive things inside the book. So the original word used here is Hebel, which I'm definitely saying wrong. The most direct translation of this word is vapor or breath. Now, that's quite an obscure idea. I mean, what could he possibly mean in using these two words to describe life? He frequently mentions throughout the text this phrase, chasing after the wind. And in this way, he's highlighting the futileness of the activities that he goes on to describe. By this, he's trying to indicate the short-lived nature of the endeavors we commit and dedicate ourselves to in life. In the famous Proverbs 31 passage, this word appears as fleeting, and that's probably not a terrible rendering of the word, since it highlights that short-lived nature of beauty. And what can the value really be of something that simply passes? Especially when the teacher here is considering that we dedicate our lives, energy, and money to it. The teacher goes on to say in verse 3, a statement that summarizes well the conundrum that he is facing. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? He is wondering, what is the result of all our hard work, and is the result really worth it? He goes on to say that generations come and go. The sun rises and the sun sets. So these cycles of life and the cycles that exist in the world, they stay the same. Nothing ultimately changes anything of significance. But then he goes on to make another statement that I think completes this framing of where he's going. He says in verse 8, no matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. Is this true? I like to believe that there are genuinely people out there that are content and satisfied. But I guess the truth is that I don't know those people. The communities in which I live, they don't exist. This additional layer added to the teacher's previous statements establish a vital position worth considering. Firstly, the endeavors that we commit ourselves to, travel, career accolades, accumulating wealth. I'm really going to upset at least my husband on this one, but the decadent foods we eat, and of course beauty and the maintenance of our physical appearance. These things are all passing. Not a single one of these things will last. And for the effort we expend, is the outcome significant enough? Does it really validate the investment we put in? Especially since we eventually won't be satisfied with what we have. I'm just going to expand on some of this because I think in reality we don't really pause enough to consider what our lifestyles are costing us. And I think to be impacted by this message, to hear the deeper call of God in this message, we really need to take a look at ourselves. We are literally killing ourselves by the lifestyle that we live. There are so many health-related issues that are caused by very simple things like stress or lack of sleep or indulgent habits. Not to mention the neglect of relationships that we experience in the pursuit of this lifestyle. Now, I'm just as guilty of this, and often my argument to God is, well, I didn't start this cycle. The pace and the demands of the city that we live in to some degree dictate what our lives look like. For example, working long hours is not always my choice. So I'm actually not necessarily saying we're at fault for all of this. What I am saying, though, is does the outcome really justify the cost? If we were to look at this from a business perspective, would the cost-benefit analysis really stand? I don't think it would, and I think you probably agree with me. We wouldn't invest our money in this project, not for what we gain. Especially, and this is the clincher, especially when we eventually won't be satisfied with what we have gained. One decadent steak is never enough. We will eventually want another. Maybe not on the same night, but in another week's time. One accolade will not be enough, because once you gain it, you will become accustomed to it and you'll want to move on to the next thing. You'll probably never be pretty enough because, let's face it, even the most beautiful people on the earth are not satisfied with their looks. You might go to Italy for a 2-week holiday, but not only will it go so quickly, but for the next year you'll be posting on social media about how much you wish you were still back there. And you'll be planning for the next trip within days of returning. This one really gets to me because all I've been wanting to do for the last 2 years is travel. And no matter how much it doesn't make sense, I can't help that I still want to do it. So this is what I'm saying. I'm in the same boat as you. Even when you have $1 million, it won't be enough. And in Sydney, that's probably actually true. Now, $1 million buys you an apartment, not a house, not a big acreage like it used to. An apartment in suburban Sydney, not even the city. So we are not easily satisfied and we are not easily content. There is generally something that we are chasing. There is usually something we desire that we don't currently have. And it's really hard to get off that train. This is the position from which the teacher writes the book of Ecclesiastes. He has done a whole bunch of activities to demonstrate this conclusion he has come to, that he begins to detail throughout the book. There are 4 big pursuits that the teacher has committed to prior to writing this that he discusses. I will say that there are other things that he also discusses that I'm not going to mention as big topics in this. And so I really do encourage you to go read that. Like, he does talk about things like politics, which I'm not going to talk to in this. But these are the 4 key things that I think really stick out and maybe are even relevant to our generation. They are, number 1, pleasure. Number 2, wealth. Number 3, success. And number 4, wisdom. So wisdom, I'm probably doing even more so because of how much he talks about it. And he mentions it at first, but he sort of strangely doesn't get into the thick of that topic until a little bit later. So let's start by looking at pleasure then. The teacher has allowed himself full access to all the things that are considered pleasurable and good in life. He builds large homes, he plants beautiful vineyards, he buys slaves, livestock, he collects gold and silver, he hires entertainers, which is probably the closest thing you can get to Netflix in that time. And of course, he had many, many beautiful concubines. I mean, even though the scholars don't necessarily think this is Solomon, it certainly sounds a lot like what we know of Solomon. What is being described here is the epitome of luxurious living for that time. The fine clothing and food, like, they don't get mentioned, but that would have just been a given as a part of his kingship. He summarizes this paragraph with a final statement in chapter 2, verse 10. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. Whew, okay, far out. I mean, imagine being able to do and have whatever pleasurable thing you wanted. Like, what would your life look like? Well, I'm not going to let you run off with that fantasy land for too long, because the teacher concludes the following in chapter 2, verse 11. Like, he goes on. He says, "But as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere." So few of us would actually be able to say that we have been able to say yes to our every whim and desire for pleasure in this life. That's not a common scenario to be found in. But the teacher had this opportunity, and after putting no limits on pleasure, his findings are this: nothing was really worthwhile about it. Nothing. Nothing he pursued when it came to pleasure was enough to validate pleasure as a pursuit. Nothing was valuable enough to justify the effort and energy required to maintain this kind of pursuit in life. I mean, this in itself is absolutely mind-blowing for us as Christians. When it comes to pleasure, we may not all be running out there to gain sexual experiences and stuff that is quite obviously sin. But how many of us are trying to build our sanctuaries and our investment portfolios, or our travel blogs, or our closets? How about our vacation homes or our food diaries? Just so you know, I am literally guilty of all of these things. This message is directed at me as much as anyone else. I follow Facebook groups right now for travel and vacation homes. Like, literally right now. I was looking at it today. So don't worry, I'm in this with you. So you might already be starting to feel uncomfortable with the teacher's position. You might already be thinking, what does this mean? Does that mean we can't do anything pleasurable? Or the question I have, does that mean I can't travel anymore? I want to encourage you at this point not to try and answer these questions. Get comfortable with leaving this question unanswered, because you need to go through this journey of revelation as the teacher is detailing it for the conclusion to have any power. And I'll warn you, it's not going to come at the end of this episode. I will have no choice but to leave this open-ended for a month and draw this all together in next month's episode. But let's keep going. We've established now that pursuing a life of pleasure is not worthwhile. There is nothing about pleasure and its pursuit that provides genuine meaning or gains that validate the efforts we go to obtain it. Pursuing pleasure is feeble, it's fleeting, it passes. There is nothing about it that has any long-lasting value. Okay, let's move into the next one, which is not really in chapter 2. It's found more so in chapter 5. Chapter 5 talks about wealth. The teacher doesn't necessarily talk about all he did to gain wealth, but he does talk about wealth and our efforts to pursue wealth that do seem pretty pointless. Firstly, he observes that the wealthy person never has enough. If you don't think you have enough money right now, there's a good chance that there is no financial position you will arrive at where money will be enough. Look, I don't know your situation, but I'm just saying there is a good chance. I'm just saying there's a good chance, that's all. The point being made here is simply that the desire for wealth is not necessarily because the lack is real. Then he goes on to provide some reasons for the pointlessness, that he says, of pursuing wealth. His first reason is because even if you have wealth, there is always a host of people who will spend it with you or spend it for you. It's kind of an interesting statement, actually. It could be talking about people coming and asking to borrow money, or it could be the fact that as you jump into higher spheres of income, you inevitably meet people in the same income bracket as you, who then also socialize at a certain level, so your expenditure level increases as you increase your income bracket. He could even be saying that the pursuit of wealth attracts many people who actually don't care a great deal about you, but will happily use you to enjoy your wealthy lifestyle. I mean, I've never thought about this stuff before, but yeah, I can imagine that when you're really wealthy, there'd be a whole bunch of fakes surrounding you because of the lifestyle that your wealth affords you and them. His second reason is that the rich seldom get a good night's sleep. He's basically saying that wealth increases stress. Now, I can't say if that's true between my income level and Elon Musk, but I imagine that there are a whole host of complexities that certainly arise out of simply being rich. I definitely can say that having more money, for instance, after we sold our property, increased my stress levels because my family began to live at a certain lifestyle level that our income could not facilitate. So I was constantly stressed about whether we were spending too much. And we did spend too much. Okay. His third reason is the pursuit of wealth will cause you to take risks on investments or other financial risks, and many times they don't work out so well. You may not have needed to take those risks before, but because you were driven by the pursuit of wealth, you will take unnecessary risks. His fourth reason is that you can't take your wealth with you after you die. I mean, I sometimes say that to my daughter, like to remind her not to be materialistic, but it's a reality. It's something we seem to forget so easily. You don't get to keep it. Whatever you have gets left behind. Furthermore, whatever money you have made in life goes to someone else, and you don't get a say in how that person uses it. You don't know whether they will respect or appreciate the money that you have worked hard for, or whether they'll blow it. So again, the pursuit of wealth fails to be a meaningful endeavor because ultimately it does not have any lasting impact. It certainly doesn't have any value beyond death. The teacher certainly doesn't attack wealth as aggressively as he does pleasure, particularly in terms of its fleeting nature, but he does completely reject the notion that the pursuit of wealth could ever fulfill the desire for happiness. The idea that wealth can make you happy is totally rejected by the teacher. In fact, it's the reverse. Wealth makes you more stressed. That's what he's telling us. Another area that the teacher examines is success. This isn't actually discussed at length, but there is crossover with other topics. For example, in the section on pleasure, I mentioned that he talks about building great buildings and that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of a crossover there. But there is one section that talks about success that I think is really valuable to us in our modern times. And it's in chapter 9, verse 11. The teacher says, "I have observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, and the strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. It is all decided by chance, by being in the right place at the right time." I actually don't think there is an area in life that is more commonly pursued in our modern era than success. Everything is about having a certain lifestyle, being somebody, having accolades, and making your mark. We believe these things make life valuable. So what then is the teacher saying here? He's saying that if success is your driver, the certainty of your outcome, no matter how talented you are or how hard you work, is not actually guaranteed. There are other factors at play that are completely outside of your control. For example, opportunity. Being in the right place at the right time is a massive predictor. Even if you arrive at the desired position of success, it doesn't mean you were actually the best. Being driven by success won't guarantee you will be successful. There are a lot of driven people out there who are willing to make all the sacrifices that will never arrive at their goal. And there are so many different reasons why this might happen. The teacher doesn't necessarily get into this, but I'm going to get into it for you now, just so you have some examples. For an athlete, it could be injury. How many times have you heard of this? Like of an athlete who's worked so hard and, just a niggling knee injury just continues to bother them and be a barrier to them experiencing the success that they've wanted. Or for a singer, it could be missing the performance that the recording company rep attended. It could be a death in the family that takes you out of the office when the CEO comes to town. It could be a racist, sexist judge that decides who gets the award, and it's probably not you. There are literally so many people who will not arrive at their preferred future, and it won't be because they weren't good enough. What a sad state of affairs. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is the teacher saying then that we shouldn't pursue success either? Again, my encouragement to you right now is not to attempt to answer that question. Leave it hanging. Allow the teacher to show you his answer in time, rather than try to logically work this one out on your own. He has more to say. The final area that the teacher has explored is his passion. And even though he discredits it as a means of pursuit, he still presents many random wise sayings throughout the text. This final area is wisdom. The teacher concludes quite early that pursuing wisdom is a chasing of the wind. But I think the most convincing section about the futility of pursuing wisdom comes in chapter 2. The teacher decides to compare wisdom and folly. He says in verse 13, I thought, wisdom is better than foolishness, just as the light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they are going, but fools walk in the dark. Yet I saw that the wise and the foolish share the same fate. Both will die. See, in the long run, wisdom did not advantage the wise over the foolish. The same fate awaits them both. Now, we can't underestimate how significant this was to the teacher. He had spent his whole life pursuing wisdom. In chapter 1, verse 18, he even goes so far to say that wisdom has caused him great grief, and an increase in knowledge has only increased his sorrow. Why is this so difficult? The teacher had put his hopes in wisdom, only to find that knowing more didn't hold the great key to happiness that he thought it would. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I can't help but see this same principle at work in social media. Knowing more about what is going on in the world does not make you a more content or happier person. In fact, it seems to have the reverse effect. And I think part of this conundrum the teacher is experiencing is that God's wisdom is incomparable to human wisdom. God's wisdom would make humans quite crazy, perhaps like what we are seeing in the teacher right now. We think we can know all, that we might arrive at that place. We want the knowledge of good and evil, but actually it doesn't help us. Maybe we weren't designed to be able to handle that kind of knowledge. We may be less naive now, but we aren't more peaceful. Now again, I'm not saying the idea here is to abolish the pursuit of wisdom or knowledge, but it is important to recognize its limits. It will never satisfy. Okay. Let's take a step back for a moment and just consider a few things. Firstly, we need to understand that there's a very good chance, a very, very good chance that the teacher does not believe in an afterlife. We know that in the Old Testament, the idea of an afterlife was not developed. We cannot afford to underestimate the significance of this either. As Christians, we believe in an afterlife, that what we do here on earth has some value in the life to come. For the teacher, he is assessing the value of these pursuits and their outcomes according to what happens in this lifetime only. Okay, so that's like a really big one. Secondly, if we dig right down to it, what is the teacher really looking for? He believes that there is something out there that is worth pursuing. What does that even mean? Well, firstly, there are a few presuppositions in his thinking that might reveal what he's really trying to get at and what he's really trying to find, actually. So let's go through these. The first one is he believes value is based on longevity. So he believes that the longevity of a thing is actually what makes it meaningful or what makes it valuable. Anything that's short-lived is not really of great value. The second one, he believes meaning is derived from the change one can bring. And by change, he could be meaning benefit to oneself or others or improvements or progress. He doesn't really stipulate, but it's obvious that he sees change as important. The third one is that he believes meaningful things are new and innovative, and maybe it sort of relates to that second one that I mentioned too. But what we can see at the very least is that this is his preference. We can see that he, in his view, innovative things and new things are seen in a positive light. And the last one is that he believes meaning brings contentment. He almost is putting them on the same level. In other words, if you find the thing that is truly valuable, it will cease the inner searching. The desire for more will end. That's how you know if what you have brings meaning. So on this basis, what is he really searching for? I can sum this all up in one word, pulling everything together, the presuppositions, the things that he said about pleasure and success and wealth and his whole conundrum. I can bring this all together in one word. The teacher is searching for self-fulfillment. He is searching for fulfillment, but he's ultimately searching for a fulfillment that comes from accomplishing what the self wants. So let's just step back for a second. Self-fulfillment. I mean, have you ever heard or thought about this word? Like, it's not a word I think about a lot. But is there any other kind of fulfillment? Like, when I think of self-fulfillment, I mean, I don't distinguish between self-fulfillment or fulfillment. Is it even possible to be fulfilled by doing something outside of what we want? I'm sure most of us are driven by self-fulfillment from the moment we get up till we go to bed at night. We wake up, we eat what we want. We go to the job that we want to go to most of the time. We spend our money on what we want to. We save for the vacation we want and the place we want to go to, or the house we want to own, or the clothes we want to wear. We send our kids to the school we want to send them to. So many of our actions are driven by our own desire for self-fulfillment. I don't think we would even stop to question whether that's a right or a wrong thing. The desire to be needed, the desire to be a somebody, the desire to be comfortable. I don't even think we step back to think about whether that is right or wrong, or if that's healthy, or if it's good. The desire to be seen, the desire to be respected, admired, and maybe even worshipped. All of these things are self-fulfillments. Even as Christians, we confuse godly activities with the desire to be self-fulfilled. We serve because we want to feel good about ourselves. We love because we want to be loved in return. We do ministry because we want to be respected or chosen. But wait a minute. The teacher is telling us that all of this, anything that is driven by a desire for self-fulfillment, is fleeting? Really? Is this possible? Any pursuit that is meant to satisfy our desire for self-fulfillment, starting to struggle to say that word, is ultimately not going to end in satisfaction or contentment. The shocking thing about this revelation for me, when I realized what the teacher was really trying to say, was that everything I had pursued in my entire life, with a few exceptions, but anything I had pursued for the sake of myself, was ultimately never going to satisfy me, because anything it had to offer was ultimately fleeting. Sadly, this is where we need to stop for this episode. My goal in this episode was to make you fully aware of the conflict at the core of this book, the tension, as some would describe it. And the tension is this. According to the teacher, the desire for self-fulfillment doesn't lead to fulfillment, contrary to our feelings, contrary to our yearnings. What is the goal then? What is the goal of our lives if not to experience fulfillment? In the next episode, I'm going to answer these questions according to what we see in this book and some other scriptures too. But especially important is the question that naturally emerges when you are confronted, as the teacher was. What are we supposed to do with this then? What is a valid pursuit in life? The teacher has more to show us, and the Bible has more to say on this topic. So tune in next month for Ecclesiastes Part 2. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Pink Elephant. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or you can check out my resources on my website, meljsayward.com.